Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Zukuri temeshigiri katana from Shadow Dancer, and there's a little bit to unpack just in the name there. Shadow Dancer is the brand. They used to be known as Dragon Sword. I've reviewed a few other Dragon Sword products, so if you want to see what they're capable of or the other types of products that they make, take a look on my channel. There's a few videos featured there, but Shadow Dancer is now the name of the company. Zukuri is a geometry of Japanese style sword. It more or less means that the sword is the bevel. It's one kind of wedge shape, and it is popular in tanto and wakizashi. At least it was in the honto or Japanese-made blades or antique blades, but it's not super common in katana. It's pretty underrepresented in the mass reproduction market, and when it's made, it's not particularly made well. You know, sneak peek, this one is actually made pretty decently, but more often than not, if you see one that's marketed as Zukuri today, it's often just kind of a buffed down shinogi Zukuri blade. Regardless, Zukuri is a style of blade geometry, and temeshigiri is cutting straw mats in Japanese. It's like a Anyway, that's what it means. So this one is a Zukuri blade made to cut straw mats from Shadow Dancer sword. Now, they advertised this for $730, made out of S5 steel. I don't know if what I have is a prototype or made of S5. It wasn't mentioned to me if it is or is not, but the one that you can buy for $730 on their website is advertised as S5 steel. And that steel is supposed to be relatively shock resistant. So I've tested S7 swords from Shadow Dancer and from other manufacturers, and it's proven to be a relatively durable steel, as in forgiving to doing dumb things. When I go to whack things on a croquet stake of doom or on a metal rod in my backyard, it takes more whacks to break them, typically. So not that that's what you're going to be doing, but what that means to you is, in theory, if you go to cut a straw mat, which is kind of in the namesake of this sword, and you whiff it, and you just slap the side of the mat really hard, like a baseball bat, and that would be enough typically to bend a sword. That would be a really bad cut. And in this case, it's going to be very forgiving. It's going to kind of spring back into shape, and you're going to be able to go on with your day, not having to straighten your sword, not having to embarrass yourself any more than you already have. So anyway, that's some of the basic gist of the sword. Other things to note before I get in the review. One, this was a review sample. It was provided to me by Shadow Dancer Swords. If you think that makes me biased, you know, at least relatively at the start. And two, I studied Japanese style swordsmanship. I've done it for a while. I've talked about swords on the internet for the better part of a decade, but I don't fancy myself an expert. People tell me to stop saying that, but I genuinely don't. There are experts out there. I don't happen to be one of them, but I do have some first-hand experience, you might say. And so hopefully it's useful to you, because the idea of this video is to give you enough information to help you decide if this is worth your hard-earned $730. And to do that, I'm going to give you close-up images of the bits and bobs and fits and features. I'll talk about using it as a practitioner, such as I can, and then I'll use it to cut tatami. You'll see that, and then I'll evaluate at the end if I think it's personally worth it or not. But hopefully by then you have enough information to make that decision yourself. Anyway, on with the reviewing. All right, so I'm going to go over the bits and bobs, fits and features, and the first thing I start with is the kashra, this end cap piece right here. And more or less, it's well done. What I look for here are transitions. How does it bunch up, meet the ito material? That's the silk material that's on the handle. And ideally, you don't want to see any bunches or frumpy bits right here. You don't want to see any wood either. It's supposed to just ride right in with almost a seamless transition along the edges. The knots can be a little bit proud. They can stand out, but ideally, they don't stand out too much. And I'm not seeing any of that here. It's more or less, it looks as much as I would expect for $750. In fact, a little bit more. They've done a really solid job here. Even when you spend thousands of dollars on swords, sometimes they get bunchy or yucky and they don't do this part right. It's a particularly difficult part to do right, because usually you're starting to tie the ito material up here, and when you tie it, you have to pull it really tight and stretch it, ideally, and otherwise it's loose ito, and that's a different problem. But if you don't measure it correctly, if you don't build these parts correctly, if you don't have it all just right, then when you get to the end here, it's going to be too much or too little, and that means that you have to loosen the material to maybe get a little bit more space. You're not going to be able to do that without rewrapping it. Some stuff is going to show, or you're going to have to bunch it up over the end, and it's going to look kind of wonky. So more or less, getting it right is a tough thing to do. Shadow Dancer has gotten it more right than wrong here. Absolutely more right than wrong. Anyway, transitions look good. The fittings themselves are not particularly glamorous, so I would say it's a pretty simple fitting, but simple and elegant. A lot of times people try to do too much with these fittings, and so they put on a really braggadocious or really elaborate kind of fitting that's beyond the casting quality that they're capable of. And here I don't see anything attempted that gives me really muddy, ugly looking fittings. It's a pretty simple kind of stone texture, if you will, and more or less it doesn't have any yucky bits on it. There's no casting lines, there's no nothing that appears to be just like a terrible representation of what it's trying to represent. There are little silver shirodome in here that appear to be of a different material. Sometimes those shirodome also get cast in. These appear to be different, and they are stuck in pretty solid, and they also don't have any little spiky bits that bite my hand. So also they're a silver color, which matches the habaki and the seppa. I like the thematic consistency around the material choice here, and they are relatively nice little shirodome. You're not buying a sword for those little washers that go in the kashira, but as surprising as it is, these little details and adherence to them really adds up. If the shirodome are cast in and spiky, then every time you grab it, you feel it in the flub of your hand, and hopefully it wears down, or you have to sand it down, or you have to do work to be able to train with it, to use it, to have it be maybe the way that you want. And Shadow Dancer Swords has been relatively good at some of these relatively small details that make differences to practitioners, or just the elegance in the way it looks on your wall. Anyway, as small a thing as it is, those add up, and I'm seeing a lot of little things adhered to on this. So anyway, I'm going to move on from the kashira. It looks like they've done a pretty solid job, and I move on to the handle material right here. So the handle has a nice graceful shape. It feels good in my hand. It's on the smaller side, which I don't necessarily mind, but it feels good in my hand. And the ito is another thing that I look for. These knots, it's reasonably tight. Now, Shadow Dancer Sword does a little bit better job at tying knots, you might say. Oftentimes these are very, very loose, and while I would still say these could absolutely be tighter, it's well above average for a $730 sword. More often than not, I'm able to push these around and displace them several millimeters, even at swords of this price point. And here, I can maybe push it a millimeter or so with a fair amount of pressure, and what that does is it means I have a reasonable connection to the sword when it's in my hand, and I don't feel like I really have to white knuckle it. I have to hold it super tight to feel like the sword isn't going to move around. And it also makes me feel like the knots aren't going to come undone if I train with this for a while. If they do, it's relatively expensive to fix, and it sometimes is debatably easier to buy another sword than to send this off to somebody to get tied. Anyway, the knots are relatively consistent. I also look for the shape of them. I look to see how consistent the diamonds are, and the diamonds are reasonably consistent. They don't bounce around too much. There's a little inconsistency in shape and size, but not really too much in overall. Again, well above expectation. Now, the Samegawa skin on here, that's the white stuff underneath, another thing that I'm looking at. It's a relatively small nodule skin. Some people care about it, some people don't, but the bigger the nodules, the bigger those little balls, basically the more expensive the skin, or in theory, that's the case. And this has a relatively simple skin. It looks real, but it's not a particularly expensive or valuable skin. And if you want a more expensive or valuable skin, I imagine you could ask them and they will do that for you for more money, would be my guess. You'd have to check with them though. Underneath the ito is the manuki, these little kind of decorative pieces that rest here. And this one is, I believe they're koi fish viewed from the top. And honestly, they also look relatively decent. I don't mind the overall appearance of them, and they haven't, well, I can't necessarily make out a huge amount of detail. What I mean is that they haven't moved around, which is good, and they haven't, it looks like they're almost painted rather than patinated, but the paint hasn't come off, and they have a nice also thematic consistency to them. Well, I don't know about thematic consistency, but they have a color consistency to them between the tsuba, the fitting material. They're a darker material, and it kind of keeps my eye from going to one place. It keeps this stretch of material from being totally blank of any kind of darker colors. There's one Makugi peg here as well. Oftentimes you'll see them fit with two. This one has one. I haven't taken the handle off yet, but in the past they've come off relatively easily, so you might be able to see the Nakago in the video here, but more or less they typically have come off easy, and I'll overlay my struggles if there happen to be any, but generally speaking they come off easy. So if you want to take the sword out to clean it, to maintain it, to address something, then you are able to. Anyway, you can see a little bit under the hood if things are cracked or not, but more or less everything looks and feels in solid shape. Brings me up to the fuchi area here, and this is the top fitting, kind of matching the kashira. It looks good. I don't notice any casting lines or anything like that. Again, I think they've done a good job putting simple fittings on that have a little bit of depth to them, but aren't beyond what the casting abilities they have are. And if they do, then it starts to look kind of childish to me. And these, I prefer the simple well done versus the more elaborate and muddy. And the transitions here are also excellent. I don't feel any overlap. And what that means is as a tool, as a thing to go out and actually cut with, the handle isn't getting in my way. I don't have to fight with anything. I don't feel anything moving. I don't feel anything kind of pushing on my skin or I don't have any discomfort that isn't from my own inabilities. The handle is a comfortable thing, a solid thing, and lets me kind of focus on the training and the technique rather than being irritated by a tool. Now, some people aren't irritated by a tool. They could play with a stick, they could play with a crappy sword, and it doesn't bother them in training. I tend to be a little bit more picky about it. But then again, that's me, and I talk about swords quite a bit on the internet, so go figure. Moving up to the tsuba. So we have a samurai warrior here, and this is maybe the only thing that I take some slight issue with, is this looks like the Bugei samurai tsuba. And I don't know if it's a copy of an antique one, and the only other place that I've seen it used is on the Bugei line of swords, the Bugei samurai. And the tsuba looked a little bit different. It had some more bits and bobs in it, some more like textured to it. So it could well be a copy of some sort of antique, or it could be something bespoke to that, and I don't know. But I would rather see something that is absolutely a traditional copy of some sort of original thing in a museum, or which this may well be, but I don't know. I'd like to see something bespoke that I would only see on a Shadow Dancer sword and not on anything else. And having seen this on a Bugei, it makes me think of Bugei, and that's not what this is. Apart from my familiarity with the tsuba from another vendor, it is well fit, it doesn't wiggle, the patina on it isn't coming off on my hands, it's well shaped, it's secured well. All other functions of the tsuba are quite nice, and it looks very handsome on this sword, but that would be my only complaint about it. Moving on from there though, some notes. The seppa, those are the little washers between the tsuba and the fuchi up here, and then the habaki and the tsuba as well. Those are a silver color. Again, I like the accenting. I mentioned the silver shiridome. You have silver seppa and then a silver habaki. Now, I don't think it's genuine silver, but it's a silver color, and I happen to like that it's a little different than the standard brass one that I always see. The habaki also looks nice. I haven't taken this off yet, but Shadow Dancer sometimes puts a little shelf in the bottom of the habaki, which more or less is a little bit more traditional and harder to do, and it's a nice feature. I can also see that the habaki is sticking out a little bit beyond the blade, which is ideal. It keeps the blade from touching the scabbard, and there's not quite little feet on here like I've seen on some of their other swords, but it does stick out a little bit, and more or less it's a relatively well-fit habaki for a sword in this price point. Very often these are kind of cast pieces that are fit on every sword, and this has quite a bit more attention to some subtle details in a habaki. Now, is it perfect? Is it what you'd find on a multi-$1,000 antique? No. But the general shape, dimension, and construction show a little bit more adherence to that than a lot of folks do. So that much is nice. Also, tension from the habaki to the saya is very good. A little push, it comes out. It also secures in quite well, and the transitions between the fuchi and the saya are also relatively seamless. It happens to look really, really good. So everything functions the way it's supposed to. Now, if I take the saya, give it a shake, there's what you hear rattling is probably the sageo. I don't hear any rattle in the scabbard. It draws and sheathes really well. It's very quiet, and it kind of comes out like it's on rails. It doesn't. Well, it's a very well fit scabbard as well. Which I suppose means I should talk more about the scabbard. So first, it's got horn parts. It has horn on the koiguchi, the mouth area of the scabbard here. It has a horn kurigata, which is smaller and a little different than I've typically seen. It has silver shiridome as well. So again, keeping that theme consistent. And I don't know if they're glued in or pressure fit in, but either way, they don't come out. So I can move the sageo around and they don't pop out. That's a personal irritation of mine when shiridome are provided and put in, and then as soon as I untie the knot, they kind of bounce around and scratch up the scabbard. So if they're in there, I prefer them to be secured in there. Other people have different preferences on that, though, worth noting. And then it does have a horn kojiri little end cap right here. Now, scabbard having horn fittings, nice. I've seen more expensive swords that don't have it, so having those horn parts on here, admittedly, I kind of expect them when we go above like the $500 price point, so it's nice to see them on here and nice to see them in good form. They seem actually pretty nicely fit. The sai as well has a kind of a satin finish. I won't call it ishime as much as just satin, but it doesn't show fingerprints, so if you're using it as a dojo blade, if you're handling it a lot, the the color on it doesn't show fingerprints, which means you don't have to buff it out a lot. It has a lovely kind of theme to it. I like the brown, and then, I don't know, just I like the colors and how they come together. Also has a brown sageo that color-wise matches with a little bit of white. I think all in all, the color scheme really works well together. It's the kind of taupey, beigey warrior, but I happen to like the color scheme, kind of earth tones, if you will. Also, the kurigata right here is placed about the right spot, so you're supposed to be able to get a few fingers in there. You can. It's fit in the right spot. So scabbard wise, everything is really kind of right and tight. I like the way it looks. I like the way it's painted. It also has a little bit of dimension. It tapers just a little bit kind of towards the end here. That's becoming something that I see a little bit more commonly with Shadow Dancer swords. They tend to make scabbards that are not kind of overbuilt tubes. They have a little bit of taper and dimension to them, which is appreciated. They don't rattle. Things, little details that absolutely enhance your experience as a practitioner. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the blade, the pointy stabby part, and that's probably the part that you are most interested in. Now, again, I don't know if this one is made out of S5. When the sword was sent to me, I don't know if it was advertised as S5, but nobody ever mentioned if it was or wasn't, so it could be made out of something else. But regardless, there's not really much more to talk about than a mirror polish on the sword. So whatever it's made out of, it has a mirror polish on it, and it looks like a mirror, like you can see yourself in it. It is very, very shiny. The downside of that is that it shows scratches somewhat easily. Now, I've kind of been impressed at how few scratches I've been able to see in it, but when they're there, they're definitely there. And you can also make out some tool markings and things like that. They're very minor, and you have to kind of be in the right light. But conceivably, with Mother's Mag and time, you could restore a mirror polish, albeit difficultly, but a mirror polish can be redone easier than some of the other polishes that Shadow Dancer sword offers. Mother's Mag will do it, and elbow grease, and a lot of time, but in theory, if you scratch it up, it may be something that you can restore easier than some other things. But the polish has a mirror on it. That's it. Now, why I say that is oftentimes Japanese swords have a hamon or a hira. They're made from folded steel, or sometimes the polishes reveal banding effects and interesting metallurgical stuff happening in the metal that's fun to look at. And none of that is really present here. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but it is worth noting that $730 is not getting you an art piece or those effects to linger your eyes on. What it does get you is a hira Zukuri blade. And so, as I noted before, hira Zukuri basically means that the blade is one wedge shape. Now, it's apexed in such a way where it's rounded out a little bit in some areas. It has a little bit of meat on the bone, but honestly not a lot. This is a very light sword. It's one of the lightest swords that I think I've ever tested, and it absolutely, you notice that in the hand. It's a little bit on the smaller side, but also has a little bit less meat on the bone because of that one wedge shape, and it moves around really, really well. I'll talk about that in a moment. But more or less, it's one giant bevel, and it goes all the way out to the edge. It has a very, very keen edge. It's razor, hair-popping sharp. It came that way. I didn't have to hone it. I didn't have to do anything. And the edge is also held up reasonably well. Now, I've only cut a few thises and that's, but nothing that would be obscenely abusive. This is a more dainty sword, even though it's made out of S5, but that means that if I'm cutting branches and things like that, that's about as far as I push the sword. I did cut tatami mats, and I cut bottles, and I cut in the necks of bottles, and I whacked my stand as well to kind of test and see if it would bend. But that's as far as I took it, and I think that's as far as most reasonable people would probably take it. I abused it by cutting some branches. I abused it by whacking my stand. Those are debatably abusive, but those are things that you could encounter if you are doing, have a bad cut on a tatami mat and just slap it. So it's reasonably representative of what a normal person might encounter in their training. And the sword held up, so the bevel didn't move over. That's why I wanted to mention that, is that the edge has held up reasonably well and didn't appear to deform or diminish, and I only got a few slight scratches from it. But it's very, very sharp, hair-popping sharp, and it also has a bohi in it that runs more or less up until the last few inches of the blade. It's along the spine. I didn't feel it interfere at all with cutting, but I also don't feel it making any noise. So as I move the sword around, it does make some hasuji. It has some wind sound, but not a significant amount, and it's overall reasonably quiet. The planes on the blade are also really, really flat and smooth. There's very little to note about the planes. It's very, very smoothly polished, and the bohi has some ripple in the surface, but relatively minor. And all in all, if you're going to see rippley surfaces on swords, the bohis tend to have the most of it, and this one has relatively minor, but you can notice some change in the lines, absolutely. So anyway, shape, geometry, all of that kind of stuff. It's very sharp, very light, very keen, and seems to be reasonably durable for its size. Again, being a light sword, it wouldn't surprise me if it could bend or break or deflect because there's not a lot of material on the edge, but it didn't seem to in my usage. So I suppose I can get to that. I'm going to talk about cutting in a moment, but first I'm going to talk about using it as a practitioner. And this is fun. If it were just a little bit louder, it would be really great for me because then I could actually hear what I'm doing. But it does have some noise to it. It's a little bit more audible than some of the swords, particularly without a bohi. But it's just really light. I feel like I have an immense amount of tip control with the sword. I feel like I can get the tip exactly where I want. And one thing that I'm working on in my practice is trying not to shake and bounce. And with the sword being so light, it's very easy to kind of practice and train out some of those things. So I can't say that I'm doing a great job of it, but the sword isn't so heavy that I become fatigued, so I can really focus on my movement. And I feel like I'm immediately connected with the tip of the sword. So I feel like I can practice those motions just a little bit better in terms of cleaning up my technique and trying to finish where I'm supposed to and not bounce around. And the weight of the sword doesn't fight me in doing that. So I found that to be a comfortable thing. But the other things to note about the sword, just generally speaking, are it's generally very comfortable to use because it is light, because it makes a little bit of noise, and because all of the ito is very tight. It draws very silently and smoothly. You don't have to fight it. It's overall really well fit together. Not quite as well fit together as like a really well-made Tezando Iaito, but more in that territory than I often see from Chinese manufacturers. So I've been really impressed with this as a training tool. It's really fun to use, and I haven't found anything that really stands in my way in terms of training, or things that were obstacles to training, or things that were irritating. It was very light, very lively, and very fun to use. Now it's time for me to talk about the actual cutting with the sword, and more or less it's a laser beam. I took it to pool noodles, and anytime I had any kind of edge contact, it seemed to bite in and cut into the pool noodle, and was one of the most forgiving pool noodle cutters that I can at least remember cutting with. If I slapped the pool noodle, it would bounce around like a pool noodle does and laugh at me. But if I had any kind of edge contact, it really just bit in and cut the pool noodle. And if I had any semblance of alignment, it popped the pool noodle apart very quickly. So as a noodle cutter, it came sharp enough to do it and did it exceedingly well. When I moved on to bottles, I tried to cut it in the neck of bottles where the plastic is thickest. If you have a fragile edge, it's prone, particularly in cold weather, which I'm cutting into damaging and rolling and deflecting, or in some way diminishing the edge. And I didn't see any of that here. It stayed very sharp. And it also cut through the bottles relatively easily. Again, any kind of edge alignment that I had, it cut through the bottle. If I slapped the bottle, it didn't cut through it. It's not a magic sword. I still have to get the edge on the target. But if I did, then this sword did a lot of the work for me. But those are lighter targets. So I moved on to a used Japanese tatami mat. I say used Japanese tatami because it's full of foot oil and stuff. It's a denser mat. It's not necessarily the same as some of the other targets that folks are able to cut. Fortunately, my dojo provides or has access to used Japanese tatami for the practitioners there. I'm fortunate to be able to have access to some, and it's just a little denser and harder to cut. Now, I had to leave these in water because it's cold out, and they dry out very quickly, and they freeze as well. So it kind of stayed in the keep warm tank, but it's actually soaked, then dried, then kind of dunked in water to stay warm a little bit while I'm cutting outside in freezing temperatures. So it's not as thoroughly soaked as it might appear, but I digress. The point is, it's a hard target to cut, and this zipped right through them. I really had no problem cutting. I threw bad cuts at it, and it almost prevented me from scallop cutting. It was a laser beam on these tatami mats. Now, I'm not a small guy, so getting momentum is not, again, very hard for me, but I was able to start and stop and aim and really kind of take my time in a way that I'm not able to, because the sword doesn't necessarily do the work for me, but it won't also fail me. It'll move through a target really well. So I was pleasantly surprised by how easily this sword cut. It was a joy to, because again, it's so light. And the only other sword that I can think of cutting with that is light and moves like this is my Evolution Blade LMC, which is a light mat cutter. It's a little bit wider. It also cuts a little bit better. I'm not going to say that this cuts the same as that, but they're kind of in the same ballpark. This moves really well. It's very light. I enjoy doing EI with it, and it's absolutely no slouch when it comes to cutting tatami mats. Now, that was more or less what a person might expect the sword to do reasonably. I smacked it on the stand as well to see if I could get it to bend or to take a set. It didn't. It's, you know, if it is made out of S5 steel, this would be characteristic of that steel and not taking a bend. But honestly, it could be made out of any through hardened steel, and it would, if it's properly tempered, then it would probably respond about that way as well. So I'm taking it, I'm smacking it, not lightly, not gently, enough to bend the sword, enough to bend a differentially hardened sword, and no bends, no twists, no edge damage was noted after I did that. So that's the extent of what I cut with and what I did to abuse the sword, and I think that's probably about as much as a reasonable person is going to do. You may, like I said, smacking the stand, you look at that and say that's very abusive, but if you go to cut a tatami mat and just flub it and slap the tatami mat instead of trying to actually cut it, your edge alignment's off, whacking the stand is not dissimilar to that. So so it could happen, is the point, even in normal usage. So the sword held up well, at least it did in my estimation, and that is more or less all the information that I can really share with you. I've showed you the close-up bits and bobs. I've talked about the features and where I think they've done well and they haven't. I've cut with the sword. You got to see me do that as such as it's worth, as well as see me do EI with it and talk about using it as a practitioner. So hopefully at this point you have some idea of if this sword is worth your hard-earned money or not. But it's time I answer that question myself. And so for $730, do I think this sword is worth it? And yes, in short. Now, I don't know, again, if this is S5, so I'm going to separate that and just say, hypothetically, if this sword was made of whatever it happened to be made out of, it seems well-tempered, it seems durable, it's a little laser beam to cut with, it's fun to train with, it seems well put together, and it has a lot of attention to little details that I really appreciate. So as a practitioner's tool, it's great. As a cutting tool, it's great. And as something handsome to look at on your wall, I also think it's pretty good. Now, I'm a little leery on the tsuba, but I could change that out for something else, and then that's a problem solved. And if I compare it to the other sword that I use with it the most, there's the LMC from Evolution Blades. But I think you're probably between a $2,000 or $3,000 bill to get a sword like that. And this I could conceivably use in all of the same instances. Granted, it might be easier to get one a little bit longer or a little bit more bespoke to Toyama Ryu or specifically temeshigiri, but no matter what, you're in for a pretty substantial bill if you're doing an Evolution blade. And I won't argue that that blade is superior. It has tighter ito, it has a better fit handle, the habaki is better, the shape of the blade is a little bit more bespoke to doing temeshigiri and also being very light. And so which one am I going to bring to the dojo? I'll still probably lean on the LMC, but I'm comparing it to a $2,000 or $3,000 sword. And this more or less scratches all those itches. So if you are looking for something like an LMC, then this might be worthy of consideration if you're trying to do that on a budget and you're willing to make a few concessions. It's still a very, very solid tool, and I was reasonably impressed with it. It was fun to move around as well, and it may end up in my dojo bag a few more times. Anyway, yes is my short answer, but you do have to value those things. So it is a smaller sword. If you want something larger, this isn't it. It's on the lighter side if you're cutting heavy targets. Even if it's made out of steel that's going to be forgiving, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you value the things that I did in this video, if you want a light training tool, if you want something to practice with that's sharp, that you can also cut with, this is worthy of consideration. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I hope it was helpful. Special thanks again to Shadow Dancer Swords for sending this my way. It has been a blast to train with. I've really enjoyed this one. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.